Hello, everyone, and welcome to 3 Habits That Weaken Your Pelvic Floor. I am Lisa Gillespie, and I will be your host over the next hour as we take a look at some of those sneaky everyday habits you do that unintentionally undermine the function of your pelvic floor. Before we get started, I just want to do a quick check that everyone can hear me. So if someone could type into the chat box and let me know that my audio is good and working. All right, yay. Hi, Gail. All right, good. It's great to see so many familiar faces here, or familiar names. So this evening, we're going to spend an hour and we're going to explore some of those common everyday habits that we all have that impact the function of our pelvic floor. I'll give you a brief bit about my background. I am a body worker. I specialize in craniosacral therapy, and I've been doing that for a little over 20 years now. I integrate that work with something called restorative exercise, which looks at how people's movement and alignment habits influence the function of their body and contribute to different symptom patterns that they have. And then more importantly, looking at what they can do about it and how they can help themselves by shifting those alignment and movement habits. Today is going to be a fairly interactive time that we spend together. I have foregone my traditional PowerPoint presentation so that we can hopefully be a little more interactive. You will see, for those of you that are accessing the webinar via the web, that there is a chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. You are welcome to enter any questions in that box throughout the time. I will do my best to keep an eye on that. Sometimes it's a little bit of multitasking that goes on. I'll do my best. And I'll also save some time towards the end of the hour so that if I missed your question or if something came up for you after the fact, you can also ask it at that time as well. For those of you that are calling in, I notice we have some people who are calling in via the phone. This will be a little, do your best. I'm showing a lot of things and I'll do my best to make it as descriptive as possible. So if you're not able to see me, you can still follow along. There will also be a recording after this. So if you're dialing in and you want to watch it afterwards, you'll be able to do that as well. And if you do have a question, for those of you that are calling in, *6 will unmute your line and you can speak at that time. All right. Anything else? Oh, tech issues. If for some unknown reason my audio cuts out, hopefully, knock on wood, it will not. If you can type me a message and let me know, hey, we can't hear you anymore. Sometimes that's something that happens just on your end. If that's the case, then the best answer that I have for you is for you to log out and then log back into the webinar. It doesn't happen very often, but just in case it does, that's the best strategy that I have for you. All right, so we're going to have you stand up. We're going to start by standing up, and I'm going to have you just march in place. So you don't have to do anything fancy. There's no right or wrong way to march, but I just want to get you, no, we're not doing an aerobics class. I just had flashbacks to step aerobics. We're not doing it any right way to march in place. I just want to get your mind out of the equation for how you're standing. So giving your body a little movement to do can give your brain a break. And then I want you to pause. And without moving, just look down and take a peek at your feet. And specifically, what I want you to notice is what's happening with your left foot compared to your right foot. And in particular, look at the outside edges of your feet. So are the outside edges of your feet straight? Or do you notice that you have some turnout going on? And that would be really common. It would also be really common for you to have one foot a little more turned out compared to the other. So I'm going to have you, if your feet are turned out, I'm going to have you line up the outside edges of your feet. I'll change my screen here so you can see me. I'm gonna have you line up the outside edges of your feet so that if you were up against a wall or some other straight line, the outside edge of your foot would be in line with that objective marker of a straight line. For some of you, this will feel really incredibly knock-kneed. For others of you, not so much. If you've had a habit of standing more turned out, then bringing the outside edges of the feet into a more straight position can change the rotation pattern that's going on through your thighs. So for those of us that are turned out, sometimes our thighs have a habit of rotating inward, and then when we line up the outside edges of the feet, they feel even more rotated inward. This is not the ending point of where you would stop with this. There would be some additional corrections to address that internal rotation pattern of the thighs. But for now, we're just going to stick with the feet. So notice, does this feel really strange? Does this feel, not a big deal? You might look down and notice your toes look like they're pointing towards each other. Our toes aren't really a good gauge of whether or not our feet are facing forward because they get deformed a lot by the shoes that we wear, and because they're attached at the top of the foot, they're more easily moved and they're shoved and displaced in different ways. So toes aren't a good objective marker for what we're evaluating with the feet. And that's why we go by the outside edges of the feet. So I'm curious, how many of you, and you can just type this in the chat box, how many of you noticed that you have a little or a lot turnout going on with your feet? Is that something that is something you're aware of? Or have most of you already heard about this outside edge and it's not that big a deal? So we have turnout, a little bit slight on one side. Yeah. Conquered this. Excellent. Yay, Connie. All right. Not so much, Mary. Okay, so Emily's noticing not so much foot turnout, but a lot of internal rotation of the thighs. And some people are noticing that asymmetry, one side more than the other, or doing something a little bit different. We are inherently asymmetrical just by virtue of a lot of things, including that we don't do the same activities on our right side compared to our left side. So as you get the outside edges of your feet straight, you may be wondering, why do you care? Why does this matter to your pelvic floor? So here is your pelvis. This is the front of the pelvis, and the pelvis is made up of two halves, the left and the right ilia. And then they meet in the front at the pubic bone or the pubic symphysis, and there's cartilage in between the two halves there. And then in the back, they meet on either side of this triangular shaped bone called your sacrum. And on either side where the two meet is your sacroiliac joint. So you may have experienced sacroiliac joint pain, or you may have heard of that from friends or family members. And this is the area that is the culprit when it comes to SI joint pain. So the pelvis is comprised of these three bones, the two ilia and the sacrum, primarily. We also have at the tip of the sacrum, we also have the coccyx, known as our tailbone. The sacrum and the coccyx and the base of the pelvis are all attachment points for the muscles of the pelvic floor. And they're also surrounded by muscles of the hips that help to stabilize and support what's going on with the pelvis. So we have muscles that attach to the sacrum and then run out on either side that are responsible for rotating your legs. So when you walk turned out, those hip rotator muscles shorten and contract to allow your thighs to turn out. When we walk in a turned out position on an ongoing day in, day out basis, for some of us, those muscles adapt to being in a short, tight position. And that means that they're compromised in their ability to stabilize our pelvis, which has ramifications for what's happening with our pelvic floor and also what's happening with the structures that attach inside of the bowl of our pelvis. It's not just the pelvic floor that keeps our pelvic organs where they should be. The pelvic organs are also suspended by ligaments that attach from the organ and then anchor on different areas. Some of them anchor on different layers of fascia, that saran wrap that encases all of our organs and our muscles and wraps around our bones. So there are some that anchor on there. Some of them anchor on other organs, and some of them anchor on other bony structures. So you can think of it almost like a marionette. The organs in our pelvis, the uterus, the bladder, the rectum, they're all suspended and supported by these ligaments. And the ligaments are impacted by a lot of things, including the alignment of our pelvis and how stable it is, as well as the placement of other organs within the pelvis. Okay, so when we walk with our feet turned out, we're changing the ability of those lateral hip rotator muscles to do their job. Think of if you walked around with your hand in a fist. And if I threw you a ball and your hand was clenched in a fist, you wouldn't be able to respond and catch the ball, because being able to catch the ball means your hand has to relax and open and then catch the ball and then contract around the ball to be able to hold the ball. If you were walking around with clenched, tight, lateral hip rotators or any muscle, your ability or the ability of that muscle to do its job well is compromised in its ability to respond. So there are movements that it needs to be able to make that it's not able to because it's walking around like this, day in, day out, hour after hour, all right? So when we start to straighten the outside edges of our feet, we change the relationship of those muscles all the way from our feet up through our legs into our hip, because it's all connected. And if we start to shift that movement habit, or I should say that alignment habit, then we can start to change our responding. It also translates to walking, and we're going to talk just a little bit about walking tonight. But I want you to notice, if you feel like you are fairly straight with your feet in a standing position, then start paying attention what happens when you walk, because walking is a whole nother ball of wax. We can have something pretty solid when we're standing in one position, but then when we start moving, we stop thinking about it and keeping track of it. Then we can slip into old habits really easily. The other thing that can be helpful for you is to pay attention and notice other people around you. So start doing a little people watching, subtly, of course, don't be rude about it. And notice how people are walking. How many people do you start to see now who are walking with a turned out foot position, or one foot more than another? And you can use that as a cue to remind yourself, oh, what are my feet doing? And is that something that I need to pay attention to and correct for myself? So we have the straight outside edges of the foot that we want to start paying attention to, or the feet. Now, the next thing I want you to notice, and if you're still standing, great. And if you've shifted your weight, even better. So I want you to pay attention to, where is your pelvis in relation to your ankles? And one of my favorite tools for this is a handy dandy phone charger. So if you have a phone charger, the plug end, there we go, put it up against my shirt. The plug end makes a nice, what we call plumb line, so that you can accurately, objectively see where it is. So A lot of people have the habit of standing with their pelvis pushed forward over the front of their feet, or some variation of. So I see a lot of this, and then their shoulders are back, and we've got a slight bend in the knees because we've been told we should never straighten our knees all the way, and we should always keep a slight bend in our knees at all times. And I want you to just notice, where is your pelvis in relation to your feet? Do you feel more of your weight over the front of your foot? And if so, what would it be like for you to move your bottom, move your pelvis back? So imagine there's a wall behind you and you want to bring your pelvis back so that your glutes brush up against the back of the wall. Now, for a lot of people, they will feel like they're going to fall backwards if they do that, if they back their pelvis up. So one thing to pay attention to is, if you're used to standing like this, when you back your pelvis up, you got to bring your torso forward. So we shift the pelvis forward and the torso goes back to kind of counterbalance ourselves. If we back the pelvis up and don't bring the shoulders forward, then we're going to feel really off balance. So bring your torso forward so that it is stacked over your pelvis, and your pelvis is stacked over your ankles. And you can check this by using your plumb line and anchoring it on the side of your hip. And just notice, where does the bottom of it fall? It ideally should fall on the outside of your ankle. There's a little bony knob on the outside of your ankle called your lateral malleolus. If it's drifted in front of that to any degree, that lets you know you need to back it up. When we back it up, that allows our pelvis, or that allows different muscles of our pelvis, specifically muscles along the sides of the pelvis, the lateral hip muscles, to participate in stabilizing us and helping to keep us upright. A lot of the ways that we move and stand interfere or prevent those muscles from being an active participant. And like the lateral hip rotator muscles that we saw or talked about when we had the feet rotation going on, the lateral hip muscles also help to stabilize the pelvis. So those muscles run along, so you're looking at the side of the pelvis here. Those muscles run along the side and the back portion of the top, side, and back portion of the pelvis. And I want you to go ahead and try this out. Place your hands like you would where your pockets are, a little bit to the side of pockets. And just notice how the muscles change underneath your hands. So if you have your pelvis shoved forward and then you back your pelvis up, you will feel a little bit more activation or muscle contraction underneath your hands as you back it up. And you can play with taking it forward and then backing it up and noticing how there's a little more activation, a little more participation of those muscles under your hands. Drift it forward and then back it up. The other thing that often happens when we have our pelvis shoved forward is that the glutes tend to clench and grip, and we get this tucked under pelvis phenomena. So it's like the tail tucks under. And that's also when we get some bending in the knees. A lot of people that I work with, when they back it up, the common theme that I hear is, oh my gosh, it feels like I'm sticking my butt out. Yes, If you have been walking around like this a lot, it definitely will feel like you are sticking your butt out when you untuck and back it up. When we clench the glutes, just like when we clench the lateral rotators of the hips, they miss out on being able to participate fully in stabilizing our pelvis and also helping to anchor our pelvic floor. One of the cool things about the glutes is, here you are looking at the back of the pelvis. So the glutes anchor on either side of the sacrum, and then they wrap around to form the contour of our behind. As they anchor on the sacrum, they help to stabilize the sacrum and keep it from moving inward. So rotating, they help keep the sacrum from rotating, which helps to maintain the length of the muscles that attach to the pelvic floor. So if this is the front of my pelvis here, and this is the back of my pelvis, and you're looking at it from the side, and this here represents the hammock or the sling of your pelvic floor muscles. If my sacrum tilts in, the bottom of it tilts in, it's going to change the distance between the front and the back of the pelvis. So it's going to change the length of the muscles that run from the back of the pelvis to the front of the pelvis. And we want to maintain optimal length so that those muscles are able to respond appropriately to the demands that are being placed upon them, which should be a lot of different demands. We stand up, that creates one response that the pelvic floor needs to make. We walk, and the pelvic floor has another response that it makes. We go run to make our flight connection, and the pelvic floor has to respond in a different way. So all throughout our day, our pelvic floor musculature is having to do different things. When we sit, the pelvic floor has a lot less to do than at any other time when we're standing or walking or running. But all of those should be options available to our pelvic floor. And in order to have those options, we need to maintain a pelvic floor at an optimal length so that it can respond appropriately. All right, I'm going to pause for water. So one question was, when I shift my bum back, it also moves up. I don't see this happening with you. That is an option. If it's moving up, then that is often a sign that you are. So then when you back up, not only are you shifting it back, but you're untucking it, which will also give that look or that movement of the glutes lifting up as well. Some people, there's all different kinds of varieties. We can just shove the pelvis forward. We can shove it forward and tuck it under. There are a lot of different ways that we can do this. So the two things I want you to take away are making sure that your pelvis is stacked over your ankles, and also check and see, are you clenching your glutes? And if you are, let it go. And just notice if you're standing, so we'll play with this. When you're standing and you've got your pelvis stacked over your ankles, go ahead and squeeze your glutes. Clench them really, really, really tight. And then go ahead and relax and loosen, release the tension there. And then go ahead and clench and grip your glutes again, really, really, really hard. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. And then release and relax and let the tension go. And then I want you to squeeze just a little bit. So not full out, but just do a little bit of a squeeze, little bit of a clench, little bit of a grip, and then relax and let that go. And do that one more time. So we're just doing a little bit, not full volume, just a little bit, so that you can start to notice What is it like when I am unconsciously holding tension and then go ahead and relax and release and you let it go? A lot of us have this habit of holding tension in the glutes and other places, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But we've got this habit of clenching and gripping. Having the pelvis shifted forward feeds that glute clench and grip habit. But it can also happen whether or not your pelvis is shoved forward. So keep track of that, because we want the glutes to be able to respond in a variety of ways, especially when we're walking. Ideally, we're getting a lot of walking in, because that is such a key piece to pelvic floor health. So track yourself throughout the day and just notice, am I clenching? And if so, can I relax and let it go? All right, so we got a question here. Are you also shortchanging the lateral hip muscles when walking, not in foot turnout, but with internal thigh rotation? I find it impossible to walk when I have to use the lateral hip muscles to externally rotate my thighs. So for those of you that may not be savvy with some of the lingo there, when we are lining up the outside edges of the feet, we will, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes have the knock-kneed effect, which is known as the thigh being rotated internally. And when we have that internal rotation going on, sometimes people will think that, oh, I need to externally rotate so that when I am walking, I am not in this internal rotation. And I will say I strongly discourage people from actively trying to correct an internal rotation of the thigh while you are walking. It will potentially, at best, it will be frustrating. At worst, it will potentially cause an injury, because you're doing something that you're not yet ready to do, especially while you're moving. It's one thing to work on correcting that while you're standing. It's a totally different thing to work on it while you're moving. And I see a lot of my students attempting to do that, and it's not something that I recommend. It's something I strongly discourage. And instead, if you are currently doing some of the alignment work and have a practice going on with some of the different exercises and correctives, I encourage you to work on changing the environment, changing the conditions that are causing the internal rotation. And then what will happen is, as you walk, it will gradually become a more neutral alignment with the thigh without you having to consciously fix it. We're trying to do away with the situation, which is often foot tension and lower leg tension, that is contributing to that internal rotation of the thighs. But please, I really strongly discourage people from actively attempting to do that while they're walking, because it often leads to knee problems. All right, and then yes, when we are walking with the feet turned out, we are also missing out on these muscles on the side and the back of the hip from being able to participate in a way that they would if we were walking with our feet outside edges more straight. All right, I'm going to pause and see questions, noticings. How many of you found that, yes, you either tuck your pelvis under or you shift your pelvis forward? Pelvic tuckers, shift forward, okay? Forward shifters, yes. And then there's the double combo of the tuck and the shift. How many of you realized that you were clenching your glutes? Anybody find that, oh yeah, I do tend to clench my glutes and it felt really different when I relaxed and let that go? tend to clench. Yes. Tuckers, if you found that you tuck, then I can pretty much promise you that you clenched. It is hard to release the glutes. Yes, it is such a habit. All of these things are habits. So you may find this evening that you have a lot of habits that are perhaps not as would be ideal. And you could get really frustrated and discouraged, which would be fine and understandable. You could also see it as, wow, cool, I have a handful of things that I can work on that have the potential to create some really positive change. You don't have to do it all at once, number one. Number two, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So if backing your pelvis up all the way so it's stacked over your ankles feels really weird and like you're gonna fall backwards, you don't have to do it all at once. Just do a little bit at a time. And as your brain adapts and as your body gets used to stabilizing you in a different way, then you can gradually back it up a little bit more, and you know that you're working your way towards having your pelvis stacked over your ankles. That's your end goal. Does it have to happen today? No, it doesn't. It can be done bit by bit. You didn't get there overnight, and you've probably been doing it for years and decades and a whole lifetime. So give yourself some time to make the change bit by bit and realize that every little bit is helpful, okay? Because we tend to think, if I can't do it all right now, then it won't be any good. And it is. So I want to reassure you of that. All right. Yes, Emily brings up a really great point, that when she backs her pelvis up, she can't stand up straight. She has to tilt her torso forward a little bit. That is also really, really common. And part of it is this shift that has to occur where there's kind of a changing of the guard, where the muscles that used to be in charge of keeping you upright are having to shift the workload over to some other muscles, especially those on the back side of your body. So your glutes and your hamstrings get to start helping out. And your quads, which have been doing a lot of it up to this point, get to learn what it's like to not be solely responsible, or the majority responsible, for keeping you upright. So it's a process, and just work with it, Emily. Take it bit by bit, and I promise that you will not walk like this forever or stand like this forever. So do it bit by bit. It will come. All right. So Connie realized when she shifts her pelvis back, she realized that she went through life never being able to see her feet. Yes. How fun. That's awesome, Connie. Great. All right. Let's move on to our next piece here. So I alluded to this just a second ago, that when we shift the pelvis back, we change the workload. It's a changing of the guard, so to speak. When the pelvis is forward, the glutes are doing a lot of the work to keep us upright, and also muscles that run on either side of our spine and cross the front of our pelvis, called the psoas muscles. And when we back the pelvis up so it's stacked over the ankles, then the glutes get to help out and the hamstrings get to help out, and our quads get a chance to stop holding so much chronic tension. Many of us, many of my clients and students hold a whole bunch of tension in their quads. And we don't want to hold excess tension anywhere. If you don't need it, why bother having it? It's just wasting energy and creating bad habits that aren't serving you well. So I want to check in with where your quads are. Are you holding chronic tension in your quads? So check and see, as you stand with your pelvis stacked over your ankles, ideally, Are you able to contract your quads and lift your kneecaps up, and then relax your quads and allow the kneecaps to lower down? So there's a lifting and a lowering of the kneecaps. And if you are wondering what in the world I am talking about, I'll give you the close-up of my knees. All right, so ideally, contracting the quads elevates the kneecaps, and relaxing the quads releases the kneecaps. So the knees are able to dance and move, or the kneecaps, I should say, dance and move up and down. People who hold chronic tension in their quads often have kneecaps that are pulled up, and that is their default position. So it's just this chronic tension and elevated kneecaps day in and day out. So if you are wondering why your kneecaps are not moving, then that would signal to you that they are already in an elevated position. So who found that, yes, oh yes, I can move my kneecaps up and down, and who is wondering, what in the world am I talking about? Yes, Connie, quad tension is really tricky, and glad that it's getting better. Yay, Susanna, awesome. Anybody noticing that their kneecaps don't budge? All right, we've got movement. We have some tension, slightly, a little bit. With great concentration, yes. Yeah, you can move them now, but then you have tension when you walk. Yeah, it's a whole other ball of wax when we add walking into the mix, isn't it? All right, yay, Emily's made lots of progress. Awesome. So I'm going to get to your question. I'm going to bookmark that, Jessica. For those of you that are really struggling to move the kneecaps and lift them up and down, I'm going to show you a couple ways you can work with this. And for those of you that are finding only a little bit, this is a nice increment. So we've got step one is sit yourself down in a chair, at the edge of a chair, and take your feet out in front of you. Okay? So you have the legs straight, feet out in front of you, and you're sitting on the edge of your chair. And you can give your quads a little jiggle, shake it up a little bit, schmooze, say hello. And typically in this position, we get enough release to then be able to contract the quads and bring the kneecaps up, and relax the quads and bring the kneecaps down. So this, if I have somebody who can't budge their kneecaps, this is what we come to. So in a seated position, legs extended all the way, lifting and lowering. Now make sure that as you contract that you're not doing a bend and a straighten, okay? This isn't about bending and straightening the knees. This is just about isolating the movement of the kneecaps and lifting and lowering them. Once you have that, then your next step can be to come to a wall and take your feet out in front of you. Hinge forward a bit at the hips. And in this position, jiggle, shake, schmooze, and then contract and relax. So these are baby steps if you're really stuck with this. And then you can walk in it a little bit and contract, relax, and walk it in a little bit more until you are able to stand upright with the pelvis over the ankles and lift and lower the kneecaps in a standing position. Then your mission is to then, throughout your day, maintain relaxed kneecaps so that when you're standing, especially like if you're waiting in line at the grocery store, the bank, or wherever you happen to be, can you maintain relaxed, dropped kneecaps. That's what we are aiming for. And what we find for a lot of people, especially when the pelvis has been shifted forward, there's a lot of chronic tension in the quads and that tucking. So we've got the knee bend, clenching the quads, the tuck, that all impacts what's going on here through the pelvis. And it changes the relationship of these structures, and it changes the position of the organs that live here. And they need to be in a particular arrangement in order to function optimally. And ideally, they should have the capacity to move a little bit in response to a variety of things going on. Now I'm realizing I need to also backtrack with the lifting and lowering of the kneecaps. If your knees are bent, you're not going to be able to lift and lower your kneecaps. So you need to have knees that are straight in order to allow for that movement. And because of this habit of a slight bend in the knees, because we don't want to quote unquote lock the knees, so we maintain a slight bend in the knees at all times, which isn't necessary, by the way, it's just a habit. So straightening your knees can allow the quads to relax enough for the kneecaps to relax down. And when that happens, then we also can stop holding so much tension in the pelvic floor. I hear from a lot of people that their pelvic floor is weak and they need to strengthen it. So they need to tighten it up so that they'll stop leaking pee, or their organs will stop descending, or all of the variety of situations that can happen in the pelvis. And as we were talking about earlier with this clench, you don't want any muscle to be clenched all the time, including your pelvic floor. So there's this myth that a weak pelvic floor means that it needs to be tightened. And here's something for you to consider. A tight pelvic floor can't respond appropriately as much as a pelvic floor that is too stretched out, whatever that means, can't respond appropriately. So we have a pelvic floor that needs to respond to a variety of situations, and this isn't helpful for pelvic floor function. We need to learn to release the chronic tension, and we need to position the structures that surround our pelvic floor in a way that allows for the pelvic floor to be at its optimal length. All right, I'm gonna pause here and check in. All right, Jessica has a question. She's always told that she hyperextends her knees. She can release her kneecaps easily, but she's got a lot of internal rotation in the thighs. So she is wondering if she should consciously externally rotate the thighs to avoid hyperextending the knee. It's possible, Jessica. That's one of the ways that we work with hyperextension. For some people who are really hyperextended, they do actually need to stop taking the knee back so much. It'll feel like they're bending the knee slightly, but in fact, they are bringing the thigh bone in line, or bringing the knee in line with the ankle and the hip. So if the knees, I have slightly hyperextended knees, but not enough to really show up well on camera. So yes, rotating the thighs to line up the back of the knees. I'm being really particular about my language, because I don't want people to walk away from this thinking that, oh, I need to externally rotate my thighs. You may or may not, okay? What we're looking for, since this question keeps coming up, I'm going to dive in. So what we're looking at is what's happening with the back of the knees, the knee pits, okay? And specifically, we're looking at what's happening with the hamstring tendons. So you've got these lines on either side of your knee that cross, and that's your hamstring tendons, because your hamstring muscle crosses your knee joint and anchors below your knee. Those are our objective markers. When we're talking about alignment, you'll notice I've been mentioning some different objective markers. The outside edges of the feet, the pelvis stacked over the ankles. And if we get to it, we're talking about the width of the feet. So right now, I'm talking about the back of the knee. So if you found that when you lined up your knee, your outside edges of your feet, you had a lot of internal rotation, you bend your knees and they go in towards each other, then that's a sign that your thighs are internally rotated, which we could also double check by looking at the back of your legs and seeing if you had headlights or lasers on either of the backs of your knees. Would it be shining directly behind you or would it be shining out diagonally? And for a lot of people with that internal rotation, it's going to be shining diagonally. So, what's coming up is how do I correct, if I have internal rotation, how do I correct it? And you can actively rotate your thighs from inward to outward. So you can turn the thighs outward. The big thing to remember when you do this is you do not want to try and keep your feet flat on the floor, because you've got what's happening. If this is the lower leg and this is the thigh, you can create this torquing, and what's in between the thigh and your lower leg is your knee. You don't want to torque your knee. So if you have a lot of tension in your lower leg and your feet, which is really common, in order to get your knee pits lined up so they're pointing straight behind you, you have to externally rotate your thighs, but you also have to let your feet roll onto the outside edges. Otherwise, you're going to be torquing at the knee. It's got to go somewhere. That tension has to go somewhere. So if you're trying to keep your feet flat on the floor and you don't have the mobility in your feet to achieve that, then you are torquing your knee. So if you're working to line up the back of your knee pits so they're straight behind you, be prepared to allow your feet to roll onto the outside edges. And that is why I strongly discourage anyone from trying to do this while you're walking, because you're going to be walking like this, or you're going to be torquing your knee in the process. Okay? So that is your knee pit discussion, your unplanned knee pit discussion. All right. What about the rib cage? Oh, Gail, I love you. We're not going to the rib cage today. But so briefly, all right, I'll briefly, because I love you, Gail. So Gail is wondering, what about the rib cage? We have a tendency to stand up straight, bring the shoulders back, and while this looks good from our cultural perspective, it is really not good for our body. And it's also not good for the pelvic floor. So I'm going to tie in our pelvic floor to our rib cage. So when we lift the ribs up and the shoulders back, we are thrusting, we're changing the relationship of the ribs to the pelvis. What we want, and in that process, let me back up before I go forward. In the process of doing that, we lift up the diaphragm and we have the tendency to suck our abdomen up and in, because it's not cool to have a belly in our culture these days. God forbid anybody not have a flat six-pack ab. And in the process of doing that, we increase the tension through here. And I'm realizing I didn't bring my balloon down. So we increase the tension through here. And what happens in response to increased tension through here, because we still have the same amount of stuff that needs to go somewhere. So if it's not going here out in front of us, then we're pulling it in and we're shoving it up and we're shoving it down. And shoving it up can show up as a hiatal hernia or other diaphragm tension. And shoving it down can look like prolapse. Or for men, it can show up as prostate issues because there is no vaginal opening in men, obviously, for organs to descend out through. But there's a prostate that's underneath it all that can get squashed and irritated and decreased lymph and decreased circulation to the area. So pelvic floor issues are not just for women, and as hard as much as it is for women to get proper treatment for pelvic floor issues, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say I think it's even more challenging for men to get proper treatment because there's so much stigma around pelvic floor stuff to begin with, and there's a huge amount of lack of knowledge in the medical profession and lack of understanding, especially OBGYNs and, a lot of medical fields just think surgery is the only option. And there's a lot that can be done. So that's my soapbox about, yes, it applies equally to men and women. So instead of thrusting the ribs up and increasing pressure up and increasing pressure down, which who needs that? No one. We need to relax the ribs down, which is going to, I promise you, you're going to feel like a hunchback. You're going to feel like you're slumping and like you have the worst posture ever. And I'll also promise you, it doesn't look like that. It feels like that. It feels like you're doing this. It doesn't look like that because we're so used to doing this that the change, our brain is like, whoa, wait a minute, what am I doing? And that feels horrible. But yes, we need to relax the ribs down, and then that's going to help balance out the tension and decrease the pressure up and down so that we can start to break the pattern of blowing our pelvic organs down through our pelvic floor. Nobody wants to do that. All right. Yeah. Okay. So that will be helpful for you, Gail. Gail was mentioning she's got a hiatal hernia. And yes, so ribs down is good for so many things. All right, I'm looking back here through some questions. Susanna notices when she goes down the stairs, her feet turn out a lot more. Yeah, it is interesting. Going down the stairs requires a fair bit of ankle mobility, and most of us don't have as much ankle mobility in a straight forward and back plane of motion because we're used to walking turned out, which decreases how much Dun, dun, dun. Here I am. Yay. It wouldn't let me log back in for some reason. Okay. We are back. Did you hear what I was saying about ankle mobility going downstairs? No. All right. So what happens, yes, you got me miming what was happening. All right, so what happens when we are walking down the stairs, we often, because of our habit of walking turned out and because of the lack of use of ankle flexion, we don't move in a lot of ways that require us to flex our ankles. Going downstairs does require that. But because we don't use that movement often, we've lost it, not permanently, but temporarily. And so going downstairs requires more flexion of the ankle than we typically have. And so we turn out in order to bypass that movement so that we can get down the stairs and go around a mobility gap that we have in our body. So if we start to play with what is it like to go downstairs, keeping our feet somewhat straight, you'll feel how that's asking something pretty different from your ankle than you're most likely used to. All right. I'm just going to backtrack here and see. All right, Lori's wondering if when she bends her knees when she walks, is that why her quads are tight? Yes, and that is actually a nice segue to the last piece I want to leave you with before, and I realize we're at the top of the hour, but I'm going to give myself 2 more minutes because of our technical difficulties. So I want you to check in and notice, do your ankles line up underneath your pelvis? A lot of, I'm going to say women, I'm going to name a gender, tend to stand with our feet closer together. It's considered to be more feminine, more demure. People who are feeling self-conscious about their weight a lot of times will do this because it's a way of feeling like they're taking up less space or smaller. However, it sets us up once again for not using these muscles on the outside of our pelvis and our hips. So what I want you to practice is lining up the width of your ankles so that they match the width of your pelvis. And you can once again use your handy dandy phone charger cord and just see when you are at your current width, do they line up? Does the plumb line fall in the center of your ankle or the outside? Or perhaps for some of you, it's on the inside of the ankle. And get that lined up for yourself so that you can see visually where you need to be in order to have your ankles stacked on your pelvis so that you can start using these muscles and start asking them to participate. Now, if you haven't been using them, and we're going to do a test right here, right now, so you can see, go ahead, and I'm not going to do it because I want you to do it without getting a visual input from me. Go ahead and as you're standing, I want you to shift your weight so that you are supporting yourself only on one leg. That is your only job. Just support your weight on one leg. Stand on one leg. And I want you to notice, A, is that really hard for you to do? And B, how did you do it? So it's not just what we do, but how we do it. And I want you to notice, did you bend your knee to stand on one leg? So to get the foot off the floor, did you just bend the knee? That's super common. And if so, fine. Now I want you to try a different way. We're going to eliminate that variable. And I want you this time to stand on one leg without bending either knee. So how do you get your other one foot off the floor to support yourself on one leg? And for some of you, it may be taking the foot out to the side and maybe tilting the torso to help yourself with that. And you may notice that feels really unsteady or unstable or is really challenging. You may notice that your feet turned out. So now switch legs because you might be getting tired. This time I want you to support your body weight on one leg by A, maintaining a straight outside edge of your foot, B, keeping both knees straight, and then C, I want you to push down on your standing hip. So it's like you've got a teeter-totter here and you're pushing down on your standing hip to float the other foot off the floor. And notice if your pelvis wants to drift forward, which would be really common. And if so, back it up and then switch sides, because each side is going to have a different story. So you got the outside edge of your opposite foot, and we're going to push down through that hip to float the opposite side off. So we're not hiking the hip up, okay? We're pushing down on the standing leg. And notice, are you all over the place? Are you able to keep the floating leg underneath your hip? Is this hard? Is it easy? And you'll notice one side is different than the other. So if that's really hard for you, then you know that this is an area that is needing some extra support, and it's a strength gap for you that needs to be addressed in order to help to optimize the function of your pelvic floor. All right, I've thrown a lot at you this evening, and I want to do a quick recap. We talked about lining up the outside edges of the feet, stacking the pelvis over the ankles, and maintaining the width of the ankles to the width of the pelvis, all for the purpose of helping to activate and engage these muscles that help to stabilize our pelvis and the anchor points of our pelvic floor. We also talked about, I went on a little tangent, and we talked about lining up the rib cage, stacking the ribs over the pelvis, and how that will help decrease pressure, intra-abdominal pressure, so extra pressure in the abdomen that pushes things up and pushes things down. So getting the ribs stacked over the pelvis is one piece of that equation. The other piece is to stop clenching our abs. We've been told, pull your belly button to your spine, and don't ever stop doing that. And that creates a ton of tension in the abdomen that does not serve us well. So relax your abs. And then we talked about kneecaps and releasing chronic tension from the quads so that the kneecaps can elevate up and relax down. And the process of working towards being able to stand upright with your kneecaps relaxed down, maintaining those other parameters. And then the exercise I just showed you is called the pelvic list. And that is one way to start developing the strength in your lateral hip muscles so that they can be helpful on your pelvic floor recovery journey. All right, questions. Yes, it is hard. It is a really hard one. So for those of you that really struggled with clearing the floor with your opposite foot, or you're really wobbly, or you had to really lean over, here's your baby step for that. And there's nothing wrong with baby steps. So your baby step is to just shift your weight to one side and push down through that hip. Don't even worry about it. If you have to contort yourself in all kinds of ways to get this foot off the floor, don't. just baby step it, shift the weight, and push down. And that's going to still engage these muscles around the outside of the hips. And it's going to allow you to start developing the strength you need to be able to eventually, over time, float the opposite foot off the floor. All right. So we have some questions about, should we sleep with our feet turned out if we are lying on our back? Because otherwise the feet point straight up and blankets put pressure on the big toe. You know what? Here's what I'm going to tell you. When you sleep, sleep. I'm a huge fan of sleep, however you can get it. And I'm a huge fan of not fixating on how we sleep and what position we sleep in. There may be a time and a place for that, but I think we can get the most bang for our buck if we pay attention to what we do when we're awake and how we're doing it, and let the sleep stuff take care of itself. I see a lot of people get really concerned about how they're sleeping and what position they're sleeping in and whether or not they're sleeping with a pillow and whether or not they're sleeping on a mattress. And I do what I do when it comes to that. But I really want to encourage everyone and give you a huge amount of permission to let that go for now. There's plenty of other stuff that you can work on. So sleep, it's important. Get it however you can. All right. Melissa's wondering, quads seem a little tight, but she seems to hold a ton of tension in your hip flexors. Yes, you are not alone with that at all. And she's wondering about advice. So what one thing can I give you that will be short and sweet for hip flexors? The biggest, I would say two things. Watch how much you're sitting, because that is one of the biggest contributors to our hip flexor tension. And when we are sitting, we're putting our hips in a 90-degree flexion, and what happens is these muscles adapt. So mix it up, break up your time sitting, and break up how you sit so that you're not just here, but you might turn it out, you might open it to the side, sit on the floor, do some of that as well. And then there is a blog post that I have called Do You Twist When You Walk? And there is a stretch in that I show a photo of that is one of my favorite hip flexor stretches. And it shows the bolster underneath the pelvis. That's the one. So look at that blog post and play with that exercise. That's a really good one for hip flexors. All right. Susanna is wondering, she tends to lift the kneecap on her floating leg. Yes. Yep, that happens. And again, there are much better things to put your time and attention to than worrying about that. And if you tighten your kneecap on your standing leg, that's really common, and that'll shift with time. You're just recruiting the quads to help stabilize the weakness or the lack of strength in your lateral hips. So we'll recruit other things to help out to make up for what we are lacking, for that strength gap that we have in the lateral hip muscles. So that'll come with time. All right, I want to respect everyone's time, and we have gone over. So I want to say a huge thank you for spending this time with me, and I hope it was helpful for you and that you've got some good information to start playing with and experimenting with. And again, I'm going to remind you, you don't have to do it all at once. Every little bit helps. Be patient with yourself. Have fun. Make this playful. It can easily turn into drudgery, so I encourage you to play with it. Have fun with it. Experiment. It's a lifelong project, and you might as well have fun while you do it. All right. And I will see you next time. Thanks again, everyone.